Right. So, yeah, my name is Elisa Schramm. I'm currently based at the Post-Growth Innovation Lab at the University of Vigo in Galicia, Spain. I'm going to present some work that is linked to one of my PhD chapters that I completed like a year and a half ago, and which is focused on thermal discomfort in Catalan eco-communities, affects bodies, and repetition. You will see a lot of this side of my face because my notes are sort of on another screen. So I hope you can survive that. Yeah. So just to start with, my PhD was focused on the nitty-gritty process of transformation towards something like post-capitalism in 3 eco-communities in France and Catalonia, which I conceive of as spaces interested in communitarian living and sustainable living. And so the starting point for this presentation and the chapter behind it really was the fact that sustainable practices within eco-communities, but I think they're seen as such within society at large as well, as uncomfortable or inconvenient in some way. And conversely, living in eco-communities, moving there, implied the uptake of a lot of new activities, not all of which are necessarily conceived of and experienced as comfortable. So things people in the sites that I've been with might have gotten uncomfortable with was something like using ash shampoo for shampooing, using compost toilets, using pedaling washing machines, licking their plates to use less washing up liquid, renouncing salt and coffee, living without a fridge. And of course, next to using shared facilities that might be at a longer distance, also the inconvenience of the cold and everything that went along with off-the-grid heating, so collecting, chopping, carrying around wood. So that really was one of the things that struck me as a key source of discomfort in those eco sites. And so when I got thinking about this, I started off in the summer and then went back in the autumn. For me, the cold, because I'm very good at being cold, was sort of key. And I asked about it. I wrote an email, is it going to be very cold? Do I need to, prepare myself? And really often, and so that initial contact, and that happened over and over again, that the cold was sort of dismissed as trivial or a source of adventure. So there was a readiness to be affected by potentially the cold because other things were conceived of as more important. So I talked to, for example, Antonio in one of the sites, and he admitted, yes, the cold was maybe a bit hard, but every time there was the laughter, kind of an embarrassment. At the same time, I took this ubiquitous laughter as a sort of a recognition and allusion to the cold as a particularly notorious source of discomfort and also community tension within the group. So I got more curious and I kind of wanted to understand better, how did these people in those eco-communities manage to durably get used to off-the-grid heaping practices that they were involved in, and how did they negotiate and deal with potential issues around thermal discomfort, and I should add the inconvenience of off-the-grid heating. So to go into that question a bit further, I will just start with a brief literature review and the way that I conceptualize discomfort, including thermal discomfort, then briefly go a bit deeper into my field sites, then go into 4 empirical examples where I sort of look at different issues and how they emerged before I conclude. So I think the key argument that I want to share is the intensity, like the degree to which off-the-grid heating practices required processes of skilling and cultivation of habits through the continual adjustments of bodies, technologies, values, and the proximate environment. So there was a repetitive process of getting used to this over and over again and adjusting. And with bodies changing both through repetition and with bodies changing themselves, and so therefore impacting the sort of more than human achievement, which was thermal comfort or discomfort. And failure to engage with this on this very visceral level at times created inconsistencies and conflict. So just to start with, discomforts let's say, practices in general and an interest in everyday life and eco-communities is only like a very recent thing. And not that many authors working on eco-communities have actually worked on everyday practices, so nothing really that happens on a day-to-day level. There's two exceptions, I would say. One, Vanini Taggart, who worked on off-gridders in Canada, and Jenny Pickerel, who works on eco-communities a bit all around the world. And I think it's quite telling that one of the focal points of their research into everyday life was around how do they deal with the cold. So I thought it was quite telling. And so Vanini and Taggart focused on how domestic warmth is achieved in off-the-grid housing in Canada, and note sort of the greater intensities of participation in socio-technical and spatio-temporal processes to achieve warmth. These off-gridders had to reinvent and reassemble the technologies and resources needed to generate and experience everyday bodily comforts, as well as use their sense of thermoception, the capacities of bodies to be affected by temperature changes. And they really view the off-gridders as very willing participants in this reworking of thermal comfort, requiring a lot of effort, really. And they later on in later work explore onerous consumption, which they consider to be a type of hedonistic consumption characterized by burdensome involvement in the gathering, conserving, channeling, utilization, and disposal of researchers, whereby these practices spell out moral and practical obligations and orientations that are woven into everyday ordinary routines and accepted and embraced as inevitable. So quite a positive assessment of their ability to change their sense of comfort and convenience around everyday heating practices. And similarly, Jenny Pickerel has considered comfort to be not a predetermined or fixed attribute, but rather an ongoing process, a negotiation between different elements, climate, materials, bodies in a particular place. And while she acknowledges that there is a need to explore how people negotiate and overcome barriers to reconceive of comfort, and that this has occurred through skill sharing, creativity, trial and error, and invention, I think there's still a lot of scope to think in more depth about these issues and consider, how a reconception of comfort may be partial, reversed over time, what kind of issues emerge, etc. So both share quite a positive assessment of their ability eco-community residents' ability to change their sense of comfort, and both implicitly see values to be key in that process. But that didn't really fully square with my experience, where a lot of people struggled and there was a bit more trouble in trying to achieve thermal comfort in a convenient way off the grid. So to dig a little bit deeper into how to conceptualize comfort, I looked at David Bissell, who's a transport geographer who does really fantastic research. He sees comfort as an embodied contingency forged between the body and the proximate environment, where both bodies and objects are active and agentive. And this paper, it's really worth reading. It's really great because we all, I'm assuming, sit on a chair, and he basically notes that you need continuous readjustments over time to achieve comfort in this chair, right? It obviously depends on the particularities of the chair, if you find it comfortable or not, but perfect stillness will feel uncomfortable over time. So you have to readjust and readjust in order to achieve comfort. So this comfort is always emergent, always relational between objects and bodies, basically. And so that also allows for a more diachronic sort of historic view of comfort, whereby, it's not only different for different people or something like that, but is always sort of threatened by potential discomforts emerging in some way or another. And so there's another paper that he wrote that is extremely interesting to me, again, exceptional, because it focuses on the experience of one very, very stressed commuter who would commute several hours each day. And he examines how these commuting habits changes bodies over time, producing what he calls subtle, slow creep transformations within these daily habits that at some point lead to tipping points, where at which point a threshold of bearability is sort of crossed. And so with every repetition of a certain practice, there's a potential for difference, for change emerging. So this is very Deleuzian vein, but so it sort of shows that within that discomforts have histories and contexts that depend on how exactly the repeated performance of bodies, technologies in the proximate environment plays out, but also that might be a non-linear process. Yeah, but so, one second. One element that very clearly comes across in this conceptualization, and that I think Pickrell and Vanini and Taggart pick up, is this element of, this is not, you know, these spaces are not ordinary spaces within, you know, mainstream society, if you want to put it like that. These are people who have taken on and that have changed their lifestyles radically in order to conform to certain moral values and ideas, political ideas. So in that sense, it was important for me to add that dimension as one of the elements that shape a sense of comfort. So just by way of a very brief example, people told me about, so visitors really often had all these little discomforts around using a compost toilet, for example, but residents really often said how it was really anxiety inducing. So very strong affective reaction if they used a flash toilet, and how much pleasure they perceived by using a compost toilet and knowing that they're part of like natural circles, etc. And so to me, that very much suggests that values in this case subtly changed the everyday experience of discomforts. Yeah, so much for the conceptualization. I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about my field sites. So I did ethnographic research in 3 sites in the south of France and in Catalonia in 2018, 2019, staying in each of these 3 sites approximately for 1 month. So maybe just a general word on eco-communities. Intentionally formed communities have been around for thousands of years, but I guess we could say that there's been a efflorescence of eco-communities since the 1990s. And yeah, such intentional communities historically and still today are extremely heterogeneous and stem from really diverse influences, including Buddhist, ecologist, pacifist, feminist, alternative education, back to the land, co-housing, technological appropriation, like a lot of different things. And I just kind of try to stick to eco-communities to highlight 2 elements, mainly places of collaborative, collective, and communal living, and on the other hand, a particular focus on minimizing environmental impact in some way. I think it's fair to say that Spain has maybe in recent years emerged as a hotspot for a lot of eco-communities, intentional living spaces, and especially Catalonia and the Barcelona area. And yeah, on top of that general definition, all of the sites that I chose had like some sort of anti-post-capitalist, anarchist, communitarian ethos. So the idea was very much aligned with changing something about the world and about the socioeconomic system in some way, rather than just as some places do, withdrawing from mainstream society. And yeah, if you're interested, we can go into some more depth on how I conceived of these spaces as post-capitalist. But yeah, suffice to say that for now, the 2 case studies in particular that are relevant for this presentation, Catalan and Can Mas Déu, had kind of an anarchist communitarian autonomous outlook on practices that included something like self-organization, consensus decision-making, self-legislation, independence from government, any kind of national municipal services, and replacing them as much as possible with the local commons. So these 2 sites, I'm just going to start with Can Mas Déu is a so-called rurban, so rural, urban, sort of the outskirts of Barcelona squat. And it's really kind of a bit of a legendary status within Barcelona and within this alternative Catalan scene, because it survived an eviction attempt in 2001. You can see a picture of that on the very right, and has been occupied and used ever since. Originally, it was a home for people with leprosy, but that sort of became unnecessary from the 1950s onwards, and it's been abandoned ever since. So they're quite like established now. They have their routines. They have like a working day a week and very clearly defined activities. They're big sort of unusual things that they have maybe the biggest community gardens in Barcelona, as you can see in the picture in the middle. There's around 25 to 30 people living there. And I would say it's fair to say that there's been sort of a process of progressive de-radicalization, sort of adaptation to more mainstream society happening in this space that sort of probably coincides with people just getting older. Like they were 20 when they started, maybe now they're 40. So there's a dimension of that, even though that's not like a set process either. The second space is Calafó, which calls itself a post-capitalist eco-industrial colony next to the village of Vallbona d'Anoia, sort of 60 kilometers westward from Barcelona. It was founded in 2011, also got sort of 25 to 30 residents. And it was a former textile factory. And so you can see this is a very sort of typical setup in the Catalonian countryside, that you would have an industrial complex, as you can see on the right, combined with a lot of other spaces, including like a little church, chapel, and a housing block. So the housing block you see on the left, there's around 27 flats that probably in the late 19th, early 20th century would have been inhabited by 100 workers and their families or so. And now, you know, that not all of them are reestablished, but they live in each of these like alone or in small groups. Yeah, and the unusual thing about this space is that it is really quite ruinous. Like on the right picture on the right, that part of the building cannot be entered because it burned down. So it's literally structurally unsafe, and you should not enter it because things might fall on you and you might die. But it is kind of an example of making a living in the ruins of a kind of capitalism that no longer exists. Yeah, I see that there's somebody saying something in the chats. What did I choose?
Don't worry. Yeah, we can pick up the questions later if you like.
Yeah, that sounds good. Okay. So just a little bit about more context. I thought it was important to, now there's this chat thing in the, okay. Right, so what does living with the cold in Catalonia imply? Is it not very warm in Spain? It is, but in the winter, and I would say between November and March, average minimum mean temperatures drop below 10 degrees between November and March. And you have to keep in mind that these buildings are really old and badly insulated, especially in the case of Calafó, where, like, you know, this housing block that they've chosen for themselves is the place where factory workers used to live. So it was built for factory workers, so not really with any kind of luxury or well-being very much in mind. So I experienced it as quite damp and humid and just, you know, old buildings when I was there. So you could feel, in my view, these temperatures quite viscerally. Yeah, at the same time, what am I doing? The most common form of heating, off the grid heating, was with wood. And I think especially in the UK context, that's seen as quite controversial to do that because of air pollution, etc. That wasn't really a concern at all. With these residents in the eco communities, for them, they explained it in such a way that wood, for them, as Joaquin and Calafó says, is a resource that can be easily confused with cutting trees that would appear as not very ecological. But we have a very big problem with wildfires in the area. Before, everyone just collected the trees that had fallen down to heat their homes. But using wood means autonomy because we generate a resource instead of buying it. It is sustainability in the sense that we prevent fires and we clean the woods and use this energy that would have been released in wildfires to heat our homes. So there is a particular logic behind it. I didn't fully question like the concerns that are typical in the UK around wood heating. I just kind of try to accept that this is the practice that they try to get used to live off the grid. Yeah. And I would say that in this situation, heat generation became a form of onerous consumption, as Vanini and Taggart call it, depending on the residents' direct, embodied, and permanent involvement in producing thermal comfort. And equally is quite a significant source of inconvenience, which maybe to specify could be understood as a spatio-temporal ordering between body and proximate environment that requires high level of effort and energy expenditure. So what I want to argue, especially in regards to how did they manage to get used to off the grid heating with wood, while some other practices in these sites people managed to get used to by just sort of subtle changes in bodily disponibility. In the case of wood heating and thermal discomfort and so on, it required really a much more active process of cultivating habits through a continual readjustment. So I had a really wonderful chat about this stuff with my host, Yolanda, who kind of described her changing relationship to heating with wood and her relationship really to the fire. So at first, so how does she get used to it? She says, oh, it's a drag. At the beginning, I wouldn't be bothered. But then over time, with repetition, repeated intervention in this assemblage of the stove, the wood, the fire, etc., her affective disposition, her bodily disposition towards the practice changed, and in that way actively aligned the political values of the sites with her bodily experience. And this in the end led to quite a lot of fascination and experimentation. She says, oh, there's all these different ways of doing it. She likes to experiment. She loves to watch the flames and is quite absorbed by it. So she's kind of getting fascinated by the thing that fossil fueled energy provision can't provide, which is the particularities and inconsistencies that are characteristic of localized arrangements of matter energy, as Clark and Yusuf call it. Yeah, but then over time, this kind of changes again, and she notices that when I concentrate on a lot on something for a few hours, the fire extinguished. So she says, oh, I think like January and February from 6 in the afternoon, if every 10 minutes you have to add a little log, I will go crazy. There's a real like clash of practices of different rhythms where the inconvenience of wood heating comes to the fore in a different light, as she had to realign the requirements of different practices and bundles of activities and their rhythms with, of the grid heating implying rather different and more demanding rhythms, which interrupted other activities practices such as computer-based work. So while in the first case, when heating with wood was unfamiliar, she changed something about her bodily abilities by getting more and more used and fascinated by the fire stove. In this case, she adapted the technology itself, and I mean, my photos are just atrocious, but she sort of the normal kind of stove that people would use is the one on the right. But in order to avoid these continuous interruptions of her computer-based work, she got herself a bigger log, and so then she would be fine for 2 hours at the time. So you can see that thermal comfort and sort of convenience around off-the-grid heating was not a straightforward process at all. It changed over time. It was deeply relational. It changed through repetition, and it had to be slightly recomposed over time to really achieve a sense of maybe more permanent comfort. In stark contrast to that is what one inhabitant in Camasteo did, which was that he went, and I think this is much more familiar, especially to British audiences where, insulation is a big theme. And I think just by context, in the Spanish context, I think there's a lot less emphasis on energy efficiency, on insulation. I had pulled up a statistic which says that 52% of housing in the Spanish context are in the E category of energy efficiency, and it's generally not so much on the radar as in the north of Europe. So incidentally, this installation effort, this entire little house you see on the right, was done by a British resident who, engaged quite a lot in trying to create a well-insulated little hexagonal house. So he had a solar panel put on the roof, and that heated the water which went under the floor. He had triple curtains. And so he told me, oh, I only needed to heat with electricity for 4 nights in a winter. So I think that seems like extremely commonsensical somehow to me, probably maybe to many of you, to sort of minimize that effort that goes with trying to produce thermal comfort through off-the-grid heating with wood and so on. But I thought it was interesting because at the same time it meant a lesser exposure to the sort of continuous effectiveness of that is so prevalent in wood heating practices. But at the same time, it stayed in sort of in line with professed values of sustainability, etc., and of being independent from the system, with a very different temporal rhythm, because this having to get affected on a visceral level happened earlier on in the design, where this resident made use of his extensive skill sets. What I was really struck by, though, was that he was trying to sort of, as he put it, divorce your basic need to be warm and comfortable from any political mission. So he tried to depoliticize, actually, this idea of comfort, of thermal comfort, which is, quite contested in the wood heating practices because it is so labor intensive. So he kind of aligned himself not only with sort of Western European cultural norms around effortless thermal comfort, but also with the idea that a sustainable life should be made easy. And he specifically linked that to the sort of demonstration role that this little hat was supposed to have on visitors. And he argued sort of, if a model is showing that now it has to be chopping wood and making fire, that's not attractive. So it just really called my attention that in this particular case, the value side of things was seen as less sort of, it was kind of divorced from this process of trying to make a comfortable home as it was in the other cases. And so this also stood in really stark contrast to what other people in Can Masdeo did, which was putting not that much. I mean, many people used wood heating as necessary, but some people just didn't do anything at all about it, and they just ignored it altogether. So I kind of speculated, especially with Enzo, this British inhabitant, why that might be. And sort of he argued that another resident, for example, would consider that anything done professionally or well is capitalist. And so to be warm and comfortable is capitalist and consumerist. And then the hard and dark, that's proper squatting. But according to him, that was not a political philosophy to replicate. So here, with this group of people who just refused to do anything much about thermal discomfort, energy efficiency, insulation were, as Noche Mares would put it, deliberately invested with political and moral capacities, whereby energy efficiency, insulation was aligned with a capitalism that they sought to resist, and standing in a direct contrast with Enzo's maybe less political approach. There's also perhaps a sense of suffering for a cause, constituting a kind of environmental politics of sacrifice, as Maniatis and Mayer call it, which is often centered around ideas of comfort. And it also fits in with some of the stuff that Pickerel has observed, whereby some people actively seek discomfort. And so it also, on a more abstract level, highlights the role of values and ethics to maintain practices that are not conducive to thermal comfort. So in this case, so far that seems to kind of contradict what I had previously described, focusing on the necessity of bodily adaptation, body technology adaptation over time. However, nicely enough for my theoretical purposes, some people just like had a moment and would start using electric heaters. So there was a sense that latent habits were resorted to. that sort of endured below the surface visibility maybe for some time, as people just thought that, oh, if they change their mindset and they can live aligned with their values, that is enough to endure something like really cold temperatures over a long period of time. Yeah, so maybe there were some people who did this, but there also was some limit to how many people at the same time could use electric heaters. I just thought it was really interesting that just happened. And it was also a source of quite significant conflict and tension within the eco communities, because they didn't have so much electricity that everyone could have access to electric heating all the time. There's also maybe some exceptions, which maybe chimes with the health focus of this talk, which is that one mother, for example, said, okay, well, I had this newborn, and so I heated for him for several months because she thought that was the appropriate course of action. But the overall, that wasn't really a concern at all by anyone that was mentioned. So the final element that I wanted to emphasize that has sort of been on the, I think, sort of a latent theme through all of this that I wanted to hone in on is the importance of temporalities and repetition. So one thing is the changes produced in bodies through the repetition of an uncomfortable or inconvenient practice, which may wear down a body over time. And the other thing is changes that bodies experience over time anyway. So I'm thinking of, getting pregnant, aging, etc. So the thermal discomfort and the inconvenience of the grid heating in these spaces was in a larger context with many, what I would consider self-imposed hardships, especially in Calafell, where people kind of lived in ruins with not a lot of access to basic amenities of life. So in that context, these quiet, some people who had been living in squats for many years and quite hardened people started to have, doubts and a change in their attitude. For example, Anna Maria who's 8 months pregnant at the time of our interview, explained to me, oh, I have a lot of ability to adapt, but now there are things that are starting to tire me. It's only been 1.5 years that we've had water inside the house. And so then when in her monologue, she shifts from the first person to sort of more impersonal you, perhaps to imply a generalization, a way of justifying her changed corporeal disposition as an inevitable development. And she says, but later you want to shower, you want hot water in the house. I want things to be easier. I want good heating and I want a sewer. I am beginning not to want to spend my entire day making an effort for my basic necessities, So there's an expectation of increasing comfort, which was quite a general trend within these spaces. And a desire, and I think a huge part of it is this idea of bodies changing and bodies being worn down through the repetition of quite uncomfortable, inconvenient practices like a drip, 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 drip of change. And so this is this idea that I found so interesting in the work of Bissell about slow creep transformation, which go hand in hand with the affective, bodily disenchantment with this off-the-grid ruinous lifestyle. So one element, for example, where I think that led to a change, like a tipping point change in behavior was, people would, for years and years and years, would cut wood by hand, cut wood by hand, have to bring it up, collect it. There's loads of stages to just even getting to the point of lighting the fire. And so in this context of one weekend in November in Calafell, this insane, huge machine was brought in that could cut through 50 tons, they kept saying. And so would just be able to cut these huge trunks of wood into smaller pieces. So like on the picture of the right, I didn't manage to photograph the machine because I'm not quite sure why, but I got to photograph the smaller pieces into which the machine cut over the course of a weekend. So here again, like it would have been a repetitive process of cutting wood over and over and over again over the period of an entire winter. And they kind of use technology, even if a very energy intensive source of technology, to change the assemblage to produce thermal comfort more effortlessly. So with Bissell, this can be seen as like a tipping point where you can no longer stand what you put up with before. Even yesterday, the distribution of desires has changed in us. You cross a threshold of bearability. So all of these changes really that I've described, like people just losing it and turning an electric heater on or buying a different kind of stove, I think it's useful to also see them as a kind of tipping point. And there's a kind of then non-linearity and how comfort and convenience change through over time, in particular histories and spatio-temporal contexts. So in conclusion, I want to emphasize that thermal comfort in these spaces was definitely not treated and experienced as a fixed and static thing. I think standing in quite strong contrast to how engineers view thermal comfort in terms of very fixed temperature, 18 to 21 degrees indoors, etc. But rather that thermal discomfort and inconveniences with off-the-grid heating dependent heavily on context, on particular histories, and the ways in which bodies, their repeated performances of bodies, technologies, and values played out over time. And so I've given a similar talk in December to a crowd of eco-community researchers where I've really highlighted the importance of the bodily. I feel like with this crowd, it's maybe worth emphasizing that in these particular cases, values did shape the ways these particular means of heating were engaged with. And very noticeable is that given the viscerality with which I think we feel temperature, a lot of extensive and repeated adaptations had to happen over time, which were also nonlinear processes, which I think is another interesting thing to think of in terms of thermal comfort, discomfort. And a failure to engage in these visceral corporeal processes in some cases resulted in contradictions and fights and tension in the community. I guess I haven't mentioned that in Calafo, everything around wood and how much you use and who is responsible for cutting and for bringing it, and did you take too much, because obviously if you try to get wood out of a forest there's a limited amount, so there was a constant like negotiation and tension around within the community as well, around thermal comfort and the inconvenient ways in which it had to be achieved in this particular context. That is sort of it. I think it's been quite okay with the time. If you've got any questions, please do not hesitate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. That was fantastic. Really interesting talk. Yes, as she mentioned, if you have questions, please just raise your hands or put them in the chat depending on your connection and what you're comfortable with. I might just start off with one that was in the chat already. So that was from Noam Katsia. She's saying, or he, I'm not sure, saying based on what parameters did you use to choose the case studies?
So my very initial interest was understanding the nitty-gritty of how you could put degrowth into practice. As you can see, I'm at the post-growth innovation lab, but sort of widen it because that just fit better the cases that I eventually found on post-capitalist transformation. So I think I had an initial interest in degrowth / sustainable living in these places and understanding how does that work in day-to-day life. And then I realized that next, communitarian living and environmental focus, there was it had to have a dimension of interest in wider societal transformation. So all of these places had like some sort of opening to wider publics or engaging in economic practices that involved society at large, stuff like that. And I guess the other thing that I looked for was that people were actively doing things differently, so engaging in like material practices like off the grid heating, using ash shampoo, experimenting around, so that I could focus on like the more than human construction of these sites. These were sort of the elements that were important to me.
Fantastic. We've got a question from Paz as well.
You're muted.
Ben, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, something with my Zoom. Well, thank you, Elisa. I am fascinated with your work because I feel so I'm gonna try to ask you a question, but maybe I'm gonna be a little messy with my messages because I am doing a very similar work than you, but in the opposite case. So I think it's fascinating how we are reaching so similar ideas from so different places, because in my case, I'm working with people living in in small cities in southern Chile. And it's the case of radical neoliberalisms that have reached to people living in really bad isolated houses. And also they mainly hit with wood during the whole winter, and these are cold cities, like 6 months of winter mainly. And also I've been seeing how people is refusing to do anything in some cases, but in this case is usually related with more a resignation to live in these super neoliberal cases, and when they feel they don't have power for doing anything with their own lives. And usually this comes together with a narrative of shame of being too sensitive to cause. So I think it's really interesting how this is appearing all the time, of people feeling okay. So discomfort is something related with feeling shame, but in this case, it is shame of not being strong enough to resist and to fit in this world. I'm working in the other kind of people really very conservative kind of people. So I'm very interested in how, in your case, is people that are choosing this life, they feel empowered somehow, I guess, because they are choosing this, but they are coming to the same kind of conclusions. Like discomfort is something like for weak people that is weak and not weak enough, maybe for resist this anti-capitalist kind of life. So but this is like my idea. I don't know if you have or did you found in your work this kind of narratives of shame related with this discomfort or to being too sensitive to cold.
I mean, I'm really sensitive to cold, so they basically laughed at me because I think they have a kind of, they're just a kind of attitude of this is the kind of hardship you endure, or they have all these different ways of rationalizing it. I think it's quite common with these people as well. Like if you have to resist, you have to be a bit hard. And I think it interlinks with also certain discourses and practices around masculinity is really like these spaces sort of 2/3 male, I would say. So there are women, but often the women are also a bit like, they feel a bit like quite hardened to me in that way. So kind of maybe also embracing these masculinist ideal. But I think generally with all of these elements of like adapting to something which might be visceral, uncomfortable, it's an interaction between like the values you hold. So I guess in your case, it's quite conservative values, but also the affective relationships you develop to the particular elements of the practice, but also the wider political context. So I think something like resignation might fit in there. Yeah, but it is definitely interesting. I think there's a lot there, and people are interesting and strange around heating and the cold.
Very interesting. Okay, we've got 3 great further questions in the chat. I'm just wondering if people would actually like to speak to their questions. So maybe Antonella, if you're free to say your question, that would also be great. Otherwise, I can say it for you if you prefer.
No, that's fine. Sorry, I was just making coffee. So my question is, who are these people and where they came from, and at what point they started to live in these eco-communities? And the reason why I'm asking that is because there's a lot of theories about thermal history, and this can build up to their bodily resilience to some extent. So I was really curious about what was their life before, because I assume they weren't born there, right? So I don't know if you investigated their history and their thermal history?
I mean, I didn't exactly investigate their thermal history. What I did do quite a lot of work on was their sort of motivations and how they ended up where they end up. And so to answer the question about like, what were they doing? It's quite diverse. I think, so it was a bit different for the place in France, but since we haven't talked about that one, I'll leave that out. But the two places in Catalonia, I think a good half of the people living there were probably Catalan or Spanish, and they had been involved in sort of the alternative movements around education, Bologna, and the Iraq War. Like a lot of them had sort of an activist background, and some of them had lived in squats before, for example. So some people, yeah, they were like, you know, they started squatting when they were 20. And so for some, for example, Calafell was a place where they sort of came after they were tired of being evicted over and over and over. So yes, they have that history, but I feel like most of them actually grew up quite sort of middle classish.
I see.
Some had maybe activist backgrounds, already activist families. So they grew, some people, yes, did have that from early childhood maybe, but a lot of them were sort of socialized into like alternative anarchist spaces and ways of living from like their late teenage, early 20s, etc. I think there's another half of people who were just sort of more eclectic life stories of people being really discontented with mainstream ways of living and then kind of figuring it out very slowly. Some people from South America who were involved, yeah, I guess in movements there. A lot of people just had an activist background, but not all. Some were more interested in specific like living principles because they noticed that sort of mainstream life wasn't working for them. So I think that's the sort of dimensions. And then yeah, in Calmasdeu, I think over time it attracted like slightly less like radical people, like partners who lived there before, who didn't necessarily have the same political background. So I think that also sometimes created some tensions. Yeah, but I don't know exactly the thermal histories. I would say generally. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's really interesting, like to see how they might have come from a very privileged, somehow very comfortable background, and then shifted radically to the other side and embrace these extremes. And I find it interesting because it goes against a little bit this theory of thermal history and how it challenges adaptation to some extent. So I find this particular detail of your research very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. I think in general, though, maybe it's worth my sense, because I'm not Spanish, I'm German, and I lived in the UK for a very long time, and now I live in Spain, and my general impression here is that there are just a little bit more like, I mean, this is a huge generalization, but there's a sense to me that, oh, well, winter is very cold, and we all kind of suffer a bit. And people regularly say Spanish winters are actually the worst because a lot of them just don't really heat that much. There's not so much impact.
Yeah. So I'm Italian from the south of Italy, and I've also lived in UK for quite a long time. And I can tell you that we do not heat our homes, or we do not have very good heating systems, because most of our, throughout the years, we experience milder temperature in summertime. So we only have few months where it's very damp and cold. And so our homes are not adapted to that type of weather. And I assume that some of the architecture features in Spain are quite similar, and especially because we share quite a lot of similarities in climates. And I can also tell that we also have the culture of not heating up our home that much, or even if we do, it is not efficient. So in some homes, you have to have firewood, etc. So in some senses, the thermal history would then match, because right, it's not a huge shift from a very hot home to an unheated home. So
yeah, I think it fits a little bit in there.
yeah.
Not everyone was, like a majority was, but not everyone was Spanish or Catalan. But I just kind of noticed the change on a personal level, really, now living in Spain. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, it's interesting. I don't want to
Thank you. Yeah, and we can also perhaps take that on to extra time if people want to stay on afterwards. Guanyu, I hope that's your first name. Would you like to speak to your question, or?
Yes. So yeah, very interesting presentation. So I was actually wondering, during your case study, have you noticed or any observation in terms of using clothing as a way to heat themselves rather than relying on the technology, since clothing is also it's not energy demanding and
Yeah. I mean, obviously people dressed, I think, warmly, but also not like yeah, just, I mean, they put on sweaters and stuff. They also had, like, when I asked about the cold, they gave me a thermal blanket. So there was that. I guess one interesting element was also that the woman that I lived with, she sort of had the layout of these flats was originally like an entry room that had a window, and 2 rooms, with the middle one didn't have a window. And so she told me that she adapted where she slept in winter as opposed to summer. So in the winter, she'd sleep in the middle room, which was closer to the wood stove. And then in the summer, she would sleep to the one which had the window towards the back, which would be cooler. So she adapted herself on that level as well, which I thought was quite interesting to sort of, people don't tend to, in the way that I grew up at least, didn't tend to do these kind of changes of how they used rooms, especially bedrooms, so significantly. So yeah, I think clothes and this room thing. Yeah.
I see. Thank you.
We've got a question from Pete.
I guess. So I was actually typing another kind of observation as well. Just that it's, I mean, I don't work in the area of thermal comfort or discomfort. So as someone who's new to this, it is quite interesting that there are different scales here of adaptation. So, thinking about kind of the way that infrastructures might be adapted, or thinking about the ways in which people's possessions and clothing might be changed to adapt to, but also their kind of their bodily and then mental changes, and kind of how those may play into different kind of forms of energy consumption. That's not what I wanted to ask about, though. I was just intrigued in terms of the geographies of scale here. I guess my question was the perennial one of how does this? So have you kind of thought about how this project speaks beyond these cases, and specifically in terms of like I guess the difference between the kind of the radical case here, that where people are probably very aware of their energy and heating behaviors because they're in quite an extreme situation, right? What does this tell us anything about kind of the ways in which people may manage their comfort in less extreme environments, or in less extreme relationships with heat? Are there particular kind of findings that you are coming out of this work that you think kind of could give us hints towards what these kind of coping strategies and comfort strategies mean for, say, decarbonisation or anything like that?
Yeah, so that was kind of the starting point for the entire chapter, which was on discomfort and like the endurance of practices that might be conceived of as uncomfortable, because I think maybe a lot of us experience that we would like to do maybe more sustainable practices more widely beyond like low carbon heating or whatever, just a load of different practices. I at least always struggled with that idea that I would like to do these things, but I didn't manage to in my day-to-day life. So then for me, the question was like, well, these people who are so radical, what is different about the way they engage with these practices, and how do they negotiate discomforts? And as you can see, they engage in very lengthy processes of bodily adaptation and so on. And I think that's a really important lesson to how you speak about adapting to things that might initially seem uncomfortable more widely in society, such as, I don't know, I mean, I think it fits almost better with smaller things like, say, using a shampoo or vegan eating or whatever, that like basically just assuming that because you have a certain value set does not mean that you can just easily switch. And I think somehow in public discourse that's often forgotten. So much is emphasized with focusing on like transmitting a certain message, a certain reasoning why eating meat is bad, or why this or that is not sustainable as a practice. And there's not that much emphasis on what that means for a body that is habituated to certain kinds of practices in everyday life and how to get used to that. So like, I mean, I suppose pushing that further in my own life was to see sort of silver linings in potentially initially uncomfortable practices, right? Like that initially things might seem uncomfortable, but there's these new unexpected openings, right? Like so Jenny Pickerel in her work on the bathing practices started talking about thermal delight that emerges through the rapid juxtaposition of different temperatures. So people would jump into the river because they felt delight that it was so cold, and that juxtaposed with, you know, the heat of everyday life or something like that. Or I don't know, for me, turning towards more vegetarian eating meant that that restriction opened up a whole new discovery on a very bodily, visceral level of new recipes. And so I think just this thing of like, okay, you need continual adaptation, you need patience, you need to think about your bodily capacities and where you're at, along with the values that might guide you. So I think this is the most interesting for people who have some interest in like lower carbon or whatever living. But I suppose it also tells something about, is helpful when you think about how people often have knee-jerk reactions to certain sustainable practices, right? Like people don't necessarily say they don't agree with value XYZ, they find some reason why it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. And I think they're being quite sincere, right? Like we can all think of certain things we don't do because it just doesn't fit with the rest of our everyday life, etc. I guess with heat and heating, it's a little bit more complicated. And I think that's why it's such a thorny issue, because like I'm not sure to what extent you can completely disregard like these health recommendations about indoor temperatures between below 15 and below 12 degrees that, for example, exist very strongly in the UK. Like I don't feel like I'm in the position to say, oh, just deal with it in a different way. I do think that, yeah, there's a case maybe to be open of tinkering with infrastructures, technologies, and the way you work in a particular context. So I suppose there's something about contextual adaptation and non-blanket solutions to how to deal with indoor warmth that maybe go a little bit beyond just, oh, it has to be 18 degrees and you need this kind of insulation. Yeah. That's kind of
that's super helpful. I think I need to apologize a little bit because I missed the first kind of 2 or 3 minutes of your talk actually, because somebody came into my office while you were talking. So I'm really sorry that I missed some of that, because it sounds like you really covered those bases. But yeah, absolutely fascinating stuff. And I remember when I was at school, how they used to close the school if it got down below something like 18 degrees, you know, if there was a problem with the heating or something like that. And all the kids used to get sent home, which I think is possibly quite an unusual thing in across Europe. But I don't know if anybody else has experiences of that. But yeah, thanks, Elisa. That was really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is quite, like, this is also a kind of adaptation, is to just say, like, do we always need to be in a kind of temperature that allows us to be super productive, right? Like, or in a school setting or whatever. Like, I think in Germany, where I grew up, it was quite typical to have snow-free days and heat-free days and stuff, because it was just like, well, you can't think in that temperature. And that was the end of it. go enjoy
Thank you
the
so much.
sunlight.
Oh.
Yeah.
Sorry. I just wanted to jump
It's
in. I've got
currently
one
snowing here
observation.
as well, just to
So it's quite fitting.
I just wanted to jump in if I can, because I'm aware that we're over the hour, but with one observation, which is that I was really struck by you playing with this notion of sustainable practices as not just being sustainable in the sense of energy, as we typically conceive it being sustainable, but also being sustainable in the sense of actually performing those practices regularly and how much your body can tolerate that and so forth. So I liked that sort of playing with the words and the concepts and opening that out. And then I think building on that, how you were drawing in this idea of labor and energy expenditure. So as counterposing the energy that you would otherwise have through electricity provision or cutting wood with a machine, you're trying to be an eco practitioner by engaging with that through your physical bodily labor, which takes time and effort, as you were saying, and how in a way what we're seeing is a very clear example of bodily energies and energies from the environment or from fossil fuels playing out on this even field where you're transposing one for the other. So I just wanted to comment that I thought that was really delightful in your presentation. And if you wanted to respond to that in any way, that would be nice.
I mean, you just did a really interesting job of assembling the ideas in my head a little bit differently. But of course, there is just this idea that fossil fuel has facilitated a lot of because through that basically free energy, we have so much more energy for other things, just the basis of the Industrial Revolution. And obviously every kind of attempt to get away from that involves, in these kind of spaces at least, a greater reliance on manual energy. And I think there's a lot of cases where they had these little debates about how much energy, like easy energy, fossil fuel energy, but even like solar energy, they would rely on as opposed to manual labor. Like in one of the other sites, the blender in the kitchen reigned sort of supreme because it really allowed so many new recipes. But people were a bit critical to use something with such a high energy usage. And so that was a point of debate. Or like a thing of irony that this machine played such a prominent role in the kitchen, even though, you know, it was really like created all these new recipe possibilities. But there was, I think, quite a lot of awareness of this, where does our energy come from, and really taking the body as well as something like wood as a source of energy and of labor, and, you know, connecting these two ideas. But I mean, the way you just put it really kind of puts a really different spin and could be used to, you know, tell a quite different argument that still really fits well with what I've said. But I really like it. Yeah.
Great. We've got one question as well at the end, saying, is there somewhere where we can download or read your PhD thesis? I don't know if you want to pop anything in the chat box.
I can send it to you. It's so far under embargo, I think, for another 2 years. But I can, if you just drop me an email, I'm happy to send it to you, Anushka.
So we'll just, maybe pop. Is the email up on the screen? I just lost it.
It's literally on the slide.
Beautiful. Okay, well, in that case, I think that covers everything for today. Thank you so much again, Elisa, for a really fantastic talk. It's so exciting to see all this really rich research that's coming out. And I wish you well with where you move on with this. Thank you very much. And we hopefully will see everybody next time. We actually have taken a break for the next week. For those of you who are interested in coming back, we have a session on the 24th at the same time with Dr. Sarah Bell, who's talking about health, disability, and climate change. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Bye.